Hello, my name is Chloe Folden, and usually after meditations, meaning either my private closed group Monadic Thread meditations or public open Antakarana monthly group meditations, I usually create a short post just highlighting what was worked on, what was touched on, breakthroughs that occurred. But there was so much in this one that I thought that it would be far better to create a very short video on it rather than trying to put a post together, because there's a few things that are just easier to verbally touch on than trying to put it into a short post. So I have just hosted the Monadic Thread June group meetup, and the Monadic Thread group meditation meetups are for people who are already initiated into the Monadic Thread techniques, meaning it's a private support meditation group for people that diligently work with the Rainbow Bridge techniques long enough to access and efficiently work with the advanced teachings that are called Advanced Monadic Thread. So to break that down very quickly, the way I teach the Rainbow Bridge techniques is there is Rainbow Bridge Phase 1, open to anybody. Rainbow Bridge Phase 2 is only for people that have properly completed Phase 1 of the Rainbow Bridge techniques. And Monadic Thread is Advanced Rainbow Bridge techniques. To me, I call that Phase 3 of the Rainbow Bridge techniques, where you can only avail of the Monadic Thread techniques once you've done enough Rainbow Bridge Phase 2 work to be building or fully built to your monad and no external patterning remaining. So I had deliberately scheduled the next private Monadic Thread group meditation for in the Northern Hemisphere. Please keep in mind I'm in the Northern Hemisphere for the Midsummer solstice, for the June Midsummer solstice. So that group has just been hosted. The follow-up email after the private group meetup has been sent out. And I was sitting here going, no, rather than a short public post about the closed group and what was worked on and any healing insights, I'll create a quick post instead. So with Monadic Thread, because when you're joining Monadic Thread, you have no external patternings left, and you're working on internal. To keep it brief, internal patterning is where your genetic memory is wounded, or there's a trauma being carried through your genetic memory connected to the racial bloodline or bloodlines you are connected with. So that's why I keep trying to express to people that Monadic Thread goes so much deeper than just ancestral healing. It runs far more deeper than just in ancestral healing. It includes that and more. So wounded genetic memory are such deeply entrenched traumas that have become imprinted through your bloodlines, that those very deeply embedded subconscious traumas can cause you to have very strange reactions to people, places, environments that you can be on complete autopilot with. The activation of internal patterns can be so subtle and so under the threshold of consciousness. You might not even realize that's where the reaction or subtle belief is coming from. You're just so on autopilot with it. It's deeply entrenched as your normal. But I guarantee you, as you become more conscious of where such deep woundology could be tainting your responses, tainting your reactions, tainting your choices, it can be so insidiously sneaky the way those wounds can taint our choices, decisions, responses, and reactions. So subtle. But then when you're aware of it and the penny drops, you're going, oh my God. And this brings me full swing back to what I wanted to share. And also inspiration for people who are working with Monadic Thread, inspiration for working up to Monadic Thread level. But this would also apply to Rainbow Bridge Phase 2 people as well, because as people are aware, the verbs you are given to work on with Rainbow Bridge Phase 2, with the Rainbow Bridge Phase 2 line form clearing, that work continues into Monadic Thread in a different way, but you still have those initial recommended verbs to work with. So as part of this group Monadic Thread work, Monadic Thread meetup, because in the Northern Hemisphere, it's the Midsummer solstice. And traditionally the Midsummer solstice here in Ireland anyway, is about deep purification and working with fire ceremony for communication, what needs to be released, let go of, metaphorically, burned off habits, all of that. Fire ceremony is usually worked with as part of Midsummer solstice celebrations here in Ireland in some way, shape or form, even traditionally. So for this group meetup, with that in mind, I automatically zoned in on suggesting the group work with the verb renounce, but working with the verb renounce for internal patterning that's still refining and breaking down and doing a deep service by clearing any woundings being carried through your genetic line related to woundings around renounce. The other reason I brought up renounce is, once again, common themes that I have been witnessing in terms of client work, in terms of conversations I'm having with people, questions I'm being asked and emailed about, and also just thrown in there my own musings as well. In the lead up to hosting this Monadic Thread group meditation, just very instinctually, I was very drawn to rewatching some of Caroline Meiss's videos and her older ones on woundology, using wounds as currency. So how this is relevant to renounce and internal patternings and things of that nature, and how this all comes full circle, and why I'm sharing this on video rather than trying to type this up in a post, is, I believe it would have been in 2007. I might be wrong on that. Caroline Meiss was interviewed on Oprah Winfrey's Super Soul Sunday, when she used to do the Super Soul Sunday interviews with different people. And in Oprah's Super Soul Sunday interview with Caroline Meiss, she asked Caroline, how do you know when you're on the right track? How do you know when you are on the right path for yourself, or getting on the right track with yourself? And Caroline Meiss said, when you stop betraying yourself. And I've shared that video before, by the way, of that excerpt of that interview. So how this relates to renounce is where a lot of people get caught over not betraying themselves, is trying to work out exactly how they do that to themselves in the first place. In other words, trying to work out, where is the behavior or behaviors, where is the choice or choices that I am feeding into that are causing me to betray myself. So while everyone would have a general understanding over what's meant by betraying yourself, when you sit down and then look at it for yourself and your own situation, this is where people start to scratch their heads and go, okay, well, I know what self-betrayal is. It's kind of like self-sabotage, but, oh, you're asking me where I could be doing that to myself. You're asking me to give an example over where I would betray myself. Or hang on a minute now. And someone really does have to sit down and think over, okay, where am I doing that to myself? How am I doing that to myself? When and how does that behavior get activated in me? What type of situations am I in where that would happen? And it happens another way as well. Caroline Myss talks about this as well over woundology and being 50% healed, where you can get to a point where you have enough of an epiphany, where you've cleared yourself enough, so to speak, to where you can actually finally recognize where an unwholesome pattern is, how it's getting activated, and trace it all back. In other words, the penny drops, you're able to identify the pattern, you're able to identify all the ways it's triggered you, impacted you, what it causes you to do. But even with that insight, even with that penny dropping, still not able to fully reconcile not doing that to yourself. Meaning, knowing where your wounds are, knowing where your buttons are, even witnessing in yourself when it's happening, but they're not able to fully break the cycle and break the behaviors and choices. In other words, this is where people go, or they'd say to me, Chloe, I knew better. I promised myself better. I promised myself I would never do that to myself again, meaning the way you would betray yourself or self-sabotage yourself. But then when a similar situation reforms, paradox is because the wound's not fully healed and it gets activated, you then do it to yourself all over again, in spite of yourself and in spite of knowing better and promising yourself you do better. That's another example of what I believe Caroline Myss is discussing when she's talking about woundology and being 50% healed, where you get to a point where you can recognize an unhealthy pattern, recognize a button, recognize a trigger. But then it's only about managing it rather than trying to be able to break through and transcend it. And now this brings me full swing back to why, as a collective group, on individual, collective, and for the collective subconscious, and for racial bloodlines, we worked on Renounce. Because with either Rainbow Bridge Phase 2 or Monadic Thread, when you work on Renounce, not only does it make you more conscious and fully aware of, even when it's subtle, even when it's sneakily sitting there in your subconscious, just only tainting things, not necessarily blowing things out of proportion. Working on Renounce will cause you to be fully aware on physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual levels, where there still is something within you, where there is a needed renouncing needed of a behavior, a choice, being embroiled in a certain situation, betraying yourself with certain choices, or sneaky self-sabotage still sneaking in, and then it will take you that extra 50% as well. Continuing to then work with the verb Renounce, with Rainbow Bridge Phase 2 or Monadic Thread, not only helps you get to the point where you can identify all the little bits that still need to heal, in terms of what you need to renounce on any little level for continued health and growth. Because at the same time, it deeply resolves where those wounds are sitting in you. It helps you to deeply break through to the other side of that narrative. Meaning, coming back to the example I gave, where people would get to that 50% healed point one way or another, and they go, but Chloe, I was in a similar situation again. And even though I promised myself I would say or do differently, even though I, in theory, know how to go about doing it differently, I still made the same choice. I still did that to myself in spite of myself, like that. It might be a situation that you're involved in other people. It might be a choice that you're making just for you that's impacting you. In other words, where you know to do better, where you've promised yourself you'll do better. But then when you're in the motions of that situation, you still let yourself down. You still do the opposite of what you promised yourself you wouldn't do. And you're watching yourself doing it. And then after the fact, you're going, why? How do I keep doing this? How am I back here? Renounce. Renounce. With Rainbow Bridge Phase 2 or Monadic Thread, working with the powerful verb renounce. So to round this off and to do my best to keep this video short, I'm going to close with the definition of what renounce means. The reason why with Monadic Thread and Rainbow Bridge Phase 2 verbs are worked with is because verbs are action words. And it's in our actions, it's in our choices that we either choose something good or are led to choose the same wounded situations or wounded behaviors. It is what prompts our activity and choices that needs to heal, hence why it's verbs that work with the verbs target the unhealed activity being carried externally and internally within you on all levels, depending on what level of rainbow bridge you're working with, whether it's external patterning or internal, because that is slightly different. But anyway, the definition of renounce. So renounce, and I've added my own creative take on this too. Renounce, to say or declare through expression and action, both expression and action, that you no longer own or support or believe in or have a connection to something or someone or a certain situation because it's unhealthy for you, because you've learned through repeated unwounded action that's unhealthy or not worth it or not something you should be involved in, or it's an activity or situation that hurts you, that causes you to self-sabotage, that causes you to betray yourself. So read that again. Renounce, to say or declare through expression and action that you no longer either own or support or believe in or have a connection to something, someone, or a situation, a habit, choice. You could put a few things in there. In other words, where you are very clearly defining your boundaries and able to hold your boundaries, where you are very clearly defining what is authentic for you and not, and able to hold your ground with that, even though, of course, that can change every now and again. That's a fluid thing sometimes. What I'm basically trying to get at here is different life situations, different experiences at times do call for the renouncing of a repeated harmful choice for that person, or a repeated harmful behavior for that person, or a repeated situation that is toxic for that person. And then on another deeper level, being able to renounce what within you is creating a weakness for the betrayal of values, betrayal of promising yourself you do better. I'm starting now to just repeat myself a bit here, but I do believe I'm making a clear point to the best of my abilities anyway as to how the verb renounce is so important, why it's so important, and to why it's multi-layered. So if you're Rainbow Bridge Phase 2 or Monadic Thread, you might like to consider at some point working on the verb renounce for yourself. But coming back to the Monadic Thread group work that was just done, how deep it went for individual, group, and the collective healing. Because I'll say it again, coming back full circle as to why we worked on this as the Monadic Thread group for the collective. Because this is where people get caught out individually and collectively. Not just understanding what needs to be renounced in terms of behaviors or activities that are no longer healthy or were never healthy in the first place, but then breaking the activity cycles within you that would cause you to even be in that type of situation, involved in that type of situation. So with that having been anchored through the group Monadic Thread meditation this evening, if your Rainbow Bridge Phase 2 or Monadic Thread may be working on Renounce over the coming month, to really deeply tune into that deep wave of healing that was planted into the collective subconscious through the group Monadic Thread work. So on that note, if you are at Monadic Thread group work level, meaning you have already been initiated into Monadic Thread group meditation work, and you'd like to join my Monadic Thread group meditation meetups, like that, you must have already been initiated into Monadic Thread. You must already be using the Monadic Thread techniques, but please join me. It's a private group meetup for Monadic Threaders only, but you may join my Monadic Thread group if you wish, if you meet that criteria. Or like that, I hope it's provided some inspiration for people who are aware of Monadic Thread and working through Rainbow Bridge Phase 1 and Rainbow Bridge Phase 2 with a view, an impulse to get to Monadic Thread level. So on that note, no matter what technique you are or are not involved in, if you've been watching this video, as always, I hope it's been interesting. I hope it's been insightful. And I hope there's been a really good takeaway for you in it, no matter what technique you are or are not involved in. On that note, 7-ray blessings to all, and may all continue to find the strength and the health to continue to be aware of and define their healthy boundaries and authenticity, and find the strength and find the confidence to stand your ground with your healthy boundaries and authenticity. Blessings to all.